Well, good afternoon. Thank you for having me here. My name is Lou Ann Cherry. I live in Butler. I was a teacher at Butler School District for special needs children for over 35 years. After I retired, I decided to go on to school and get a master's degree in genealogy. I've been doing family history research since the 1980s, but recently, because of Ancestry and all of the things that are available online, it seems like everybody's a genealogist. So I thought, to have my credentials a little bit better, it would be nice if I had some kind of a degree. So I researched around and found out that the only place in the world that you could get a master's degree in genealogy was at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, Scotland. So in October of 2019, I applied for a master's program at the University of Strathclyde. Now, mind you, I didn't have to go to Scotland. It was all online. So I was accepted in the program, started in January of 2020, and then COVID happened. But that was perfect because I had all this schoolwork to do online. So for the next few months, that's what I worked on. Now, it took me 3.5 years to get the master's degree. In Scotland, when you go after a postgraduate degree, there are 3 different levels. The first level is a certificate. About 2/3 of the way through the program, you can finish and have a diploma. But if you want the whole program, you have to stay and finish the entire thing, and you get your master's degree. So I graduated in November of 2023 in Glasgow, Scotland. I went for graduation, and my husband, my son, my daughter-in-law, my granddaughter were there, and it was a wonderful experience. I got to meet people that I had only talked to or seen online for the last 3.5 years. So it was great. When I went there, I didn't anticipate how hard it was going to be. The master's program in Scotland is very different than the master's program in the United States. I was working probably 8 to 10 hours a day on projects. One of the projects that I worked on was this, the old Butler graveyard. I had to do a dissertation for my diploma, and then I had to do another dissertation for the master's degree. For the diploma, I started to research the old Butler graveyard because there had been a list of people buried in that graveyard put into the Butler Eagle in July of 1894. The list had 112 names. And I thought, I wonder how accurate that was. Was what was written in the paper, was it true? So I decided I was going to try to see how valid that list of names was. Now, the interesting thing about that graveyard is it doesn't exist anymore. All of the people were removed from that graveyard. Maybe I can get this to work. There we go. And that was 120 years ago. All of the bodies were removed from the graveyard back in 1905. People in that graveyard were the founders of Butler. There were soldiers of the Revolutionary War, children, founding families, ministers, lawyers, businessmen, and more. And the reason they were all removed from their grave is so that that building could be built there. That was the new Butler High School. Now here's where it is today. If you know anything about Butler, this is one street up from Main Street, and on the corner of that block is Butler Middle School. That's the sign that's there today. It's right across the street from St. Paul's Roman Catholic Church. That entire little square was the original graveyard. Where the red star is with the number 5, that's where the red building was. We called it the red brick building. That was the Butler High School starting back in the 1917. It's still there. the red building. Red brick building was recently bought by a private company in Pittsburgh, and I don't really know what their intentions are, but they're going to do something with the beautiful building. It's the auditorium itself is just magnificent inside. Anyway, the cemetery was that little pink square where the arrow is pointing to. And what's left of that yellow building, the yellow brick building, is right there in between those two park benches. And that is located right across the street from St. Paul's Roman Catholic Church. So when you see those two benches, you'll see those yellow bricks in 1907. That's when the school was started to be built. It opened in 1908. But back in 1905 is when they started to remove the bodies. So there's a very old map from the early 1800s showing that same cemetery. And if you could see the numbers on it, at the bottom of that little red circle, it says 150 and then 151 above it. Well, John Cunningham, and you know Cunningham Street in Butler, that's who it was named for, Abraham Brinker and some others bought land for a public burying ground right after the county was formed. And they purchased the land in a lottery system, August of 1804 for $10. That's where they got lot number 150. The next day, I guess they thought maybe that wasn't enough land for a graveyard, so they bought another section of the block, and that was lot 151, so they paid another $10. Now they own 2/3 of that block, and that was then used for the public cemetery when Butler was first formed. And I'm going to talk about some of the people that were buried in the cemetery. One, well, this is an original stone from that old cemetery. It's the grave of Amelia McFerrin Lowry. She died November 5th, 1832. She was 44 years old. She was the wife of Senator Walter Lowry. Now, she married her husband Walter in January of 1803. He studied under her father. Her father was Reverend John McFerrin. Reverend McFerrin was the first Presbyterian minister in Butler. He started the first church in Butler, for the Presbyterian church. Amelia and Walter had 8 children. 3 of them were missionaries. One of their sons was murdered in 1847 by Chinese pirates. She died in 1832 in Bedford, Pennsylvania. She was on her way to see her husband, who was then Honorable Walter Lowry, the Secretary of the Senate in Washington, D.C. So the Lowry House today, where they lived, is where the Butler Historical Society has its office, right behind the courthouse in Butler. Now, Walter Lowry was not buried in the old cemetery, but I thought you might be interested to learn a little bit about him. He was quite important in his time. He was in the State House of Representatives from 1811 to 1812. He was in the State Senate from 1813 to 1819. And then he went on to the U.S. Senate and served there from 1819 to 1825. He was then Secretary of the United States Senate from 1825 to 1836. After that, he worked for the foreign missions, and he was living in New York City. He got remarried. He died in 1868, and he is buried in a crypt in the First Presbyterian Church in New York City. So Amelia Lowry had married quite an important man. One of the other men buried in the old Butler Cemetery was Thomas McKee. Thomas served in the 1st Regiment of the Pennsylvania Line during the Revolutionary War. He owned 270 acres of land and 2 cows in 1803 in Middlesex Township. And at that time, Middlesex Township would have been where the city of Butler is, because those township lines have changed about 3 times since the county was formed. He married Martha Hogue. Sometimes that name is spelled H-O-G-G, so Hogg. 5 members of the McKee family were buried in the old cemetery. And on July 1895, this is what was written in the Butler Citizen newspaper. Thomas McKee, a Revolutionary soldier of this state, settled in Butler in 1797, and died here in 1815. His grandson, Dr. J.C. McKee, has had a bronze marker placed on his grave in the old cemetery and a fence around it. And on the 4th, the grave was decorated with a flag hoisted over it. So one of our Revolutionary War veterans was also buried in that old cemetery. And then there were 3 brothers. Unfortunately, they all met their death quite early. William died in 1843. He was 18 years old. He was killed when a threshing machine exploded. Then James was killed in a wagon accident. They were farmers. He was bringing a load down Center Avenue Hill in Butler. The wagon got away from him. He fell off the wagon, and it ran over him. In 1848, he was 21. Then John, his older brother, died 3 days later of a fever while he was in Pittsburgh. The mother, Mary Cochran, had died at age 44 in 1846. They were all buried in the old Butler graveyard. And one other person that was quite interesting is Anne Nelson Anderson. She was born in 1755, so we were still a British colony then, and she died in 1830. On the 26th of October in 1905, the grave of Anne Anderson was opened. It was exactly 75 years from the day that she had died. And in the Butler Eagle, it said that she was a close relative of Lord Nelson. Now, Lord Nelson was known in England for his naval leadership and especially the victory at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. Anne has a headstone on the ground in Northside Cemetery in Butler, almost unreadable, except for the date and the age. And I don't know if you can see it, but I could see it, but right here it says 26. This is OCT 26, and then it was 1830. When I found that headstone at Northside Cemetery in Butler, I had no idea who it was. It was partially covered with dirt, moss, grass, so I took a shovel and started to dig around it. And then, as I did with many of the old gravestones that I found, I had a spray bottle of water and a little bit of Dawn soap in there, and I had a soft scrub brush. So I would get all the grass and the moss off that I could, but you don't want to scratch the stone or damage it. So then I would wet it and use that soft brush and lightly scrub it. So when I finally got it scrubbed, I could see that date, and I could see that it said 75 years old. So I know that's Anne Anderson's gravestone. No one would have known that's what it is. It's on the ground, half buried in grass and dirt. It's a shame. She was quite an important person in her time. So let's talk about the cemetery and who else might have been buried there. I know that there were other Revolutionary War soldiers buried there. We talked about Thomas McKee, but there was also James Burnside. He died in 1833. He played the fife. He was quite young when he got into the Revolutionary War. He probably lied about his age, but he was also buried there. Reverend John McFerrin, who I talked about earlier, his daughter had married Walter Lowry. He was also in the Revolutionary War before he became a minister. John Pierce is sort of a question. That's a familiar name. It's very common. When I look up records for John Pierce, there are several of them. Sometimes it has an I in it, not an A. So I can't be sure, but I feel like we're pretty certain that John Pierce was also a Revolutionary War. He is buried there, but we're not sure if he was Revolutionary War. Thomas Martin definitely was buried there. His grandson became the superintendent of the old cemetery later, and when they had editorials in the newspaper about digging up the cemetery, he wrote a lot of editorials. He was not happy about that. Richard Miller is one of the very first people buried, if not the first person buried there. If you remember, They only bought the land in August of 1804. This man died in July of 1804. I don't know if he was buried there before they bought it. Maybe they said, oh, let's just use that over there as a cemetery. Then they officially bought the land and made it a cemetery. He is written up as being the first person buried there. And then John Mosier, of course, was also a Revolutionary War soldier. One other person is Charles McInnes, also known as Charles McGuinness. He was from near Inverness, Scotland. And his ancestor has done a lot of research. Gladys Reddick today, in fact, I met her a few months ago. She's a wonderful person. She had done a lot of genealogy research back in the 1980s. And she is responsible for getting a marker on the graves at Northside. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. So let's talk about the history of the graveyard before I tell you more about it. 1804 to 1830, that was the only place you could be buried in Butler. There was no other cemetery in Butler. Not until 1830 when St. Peter's Church had their own cemetery, and that cemetery was located up on the hill behind St. Paul's Catholic School. It was also moved. It was moved up to Northside. Northside Cemetery really is 3 different cemeteries. It's Northside, Calvary, and St. Peter's. So when St. Peter's became available, some people might have been buried there, but you would have had to have been Roman Catholic. So up until 1830, it is only place to be buried. So if I found anyone that died and lived in the borough before 1830, I can pretty much guarantee that they were buried right there in that old graveyard. Now in the 1850s, the graveyard became so crowded, they were burying people on top of each other. And they said when you put a shovel in the ground, you would hit the coffin, because they were only about 12 inches deep at that point. So there were a lot of complaints. A lot of people said, we need a new cemetery. We can't bury anybody else here. The town is growing and it's just not good. There's a school right beside it. If you remember the old map I showed you, the old Butler Academy was in the next block. So by 1850s, there was a lot of talk about the old cemetery and what they should do with it. Well, then a new school building was needed because of their growing population. Rumors had spread that the Butler School District was looking for property for a new school as early as the spring of 1894. Well, that's when Simeon Nixon, the family that ran the Nixon Hotel in Butler, that's when he got fired up about it. He lived about a block away from the old cemetery, and when he heard that they might want to use that property to build a school, he wrote a lot of editorials. And the one thing he did that we can thank him for, he went into the cemetery, wrote down every name on every headstone with all the dates and years, and he published it on the front page of the newspaper. In 1894, he wanted people to know, this is who we're going to move. That's the only record that we have of who was buried in that old cemetery, is Simeon Nixon's list from July of 1894. And that's what I based my dissertation on when I did it, because I wanted to know if what he had written down was accurate. And I'd say it was about 80% accurate. I had to change a few things because sometimes the way they wrote their 4s, they look like a number 1, or 1 might be transcribed as a 4, or a 5 and a 3. So it was just transcription errors, really. But in 1895, June of 1895, that's when the major thing happened that changed everything. A law was passed that school directors could appropriate use of any grounds that were a public burial place for school purposes. Now, there were 2 stipulations. First, they couldn't take more than ½ an acre unless the land had no interment or no burials for 20 years. That cemetery hadn't had a burial in 40 years at least. So that was okay. They could take up to 1 acre because it hadn't been used in over 20 years. The other stipulation was the ground could not belong to any religious society, any organization, or any church. So it did not belong to a church. It did not belong to a poor farm. It did not belong to any organization. It was just strictly property that Cunningham, Brinker, and others bought and said, hey, we're going to give it to the town for a public cemetery. And that's what they did. So because of that, that land could be used for schools. And in 1895, the other thing that happened in Pennsylvania was there was a compulsory school law passed that children between the ages of 8 and 13 had to attend school for 16 consecutive weeks. Before that, there was no compulsory school law. This one, now you have all children between 8 and 13 have to go to school. Well, now they need more schools. So the old graveyard was the perfect place. The law said we could take it. They didn't have to pay a penny for it. All they had to do was move the bodies. So they had to pay for the disinterment. That was it. So the old graveyard was officially condemned in March of 1905. Now, the only thing the district had to do was publicly announce that they were going to do this 4 weeks before they started. And they had to put an ad in the paper to say, we're moving this graveyard. If you have family buried there, tell us where you want them buried and we'll bury them at our cost. But it was only 4 weeks. Some people had moved out of the area, probably never even heard about this. If you didn't see the little ad in the newspaper, you probably missed it. They did get quite a few letters asking for certain people in the graveyard to be moved to various graveyards. There were only 3 cemeteries I know of that were involved. North Side is where most of the people went. South Cemetery, if you went on South Main Street of Butler, up behind where the old hospital was, there's a cemetery there called South Cemetery. There were 13 people moved to that cemetery, and there were 2 moved to a cemetery on Route 356. So most of them went to North Side. Well, the district thought, pretty good bargain. We're just going to have to move, well, let's see, Simeon Nixon said 112 people on that list. They said 200. Well, estimated at about $4,000 it's going to cost us to move them, and we want to make a new coffin for everybody. So, beginning in May of 1905, some of the graves were opened, but there was no trace of coffins or remains. And you're thinking, why? Why didn't they find anything? Because there was no embalming. Embalming wasn't invented until the Civil War. Because of the soldiers that were dying on the fields and they were trying to get them back home, they had to come up with a process to preserve bodies. So embalming started around the Civil War time. There were no funeral homes and no embalming. Families took care of their own dead relatives. When someone died, they took care of the body. They washed the body, they wrapped it in about 6 yards of muslin, which is called a shroud. And then someone made a wooden coffin, maybe a family member, maybe a carpenter. Someone dug the grave, maybe a family member, or maybe someone that did that as a side job. So there were no funeral homes. The family was directly involved in all of the process. So as you can imagine, now they're opening up graves, they're not finding much. They're wooden pine coffins, and there's no embalming. So in October of 1905, there had been 19 graves opened, and their remains were taken to new resting places. In many cases, no remains were found. But for others, part of the caskets and evidence of human form were found. That's what was written in the Butler Eagle. This one in November of 1905, a long braid of plaited hair was discovered. A portion of the skull and remnants of the bones were also found. So by the end of November, they were pretty much done removing all of the graves. The stones that you see there are all original stones from that old graveyard. Those are all in North Side Cemetery on North Main Street in Butler. 41% of those graves were children that were 10 years old or younger. And that's the ones on the Nixon list. The Nixon list said there were 112 headstones that he could read. But when I researched at the Butler School District, and I went to them because I knew they were getting the property for a school, well, they would have put that in their school board minutes. So I went to the administration building for Butler District, and I said, could I look at the school board minutes? Well, certainly they're public knowledge. Anyone can go to a school district and look at the minutes. Butler has their minutes back to 1862. Some of the best records in the western part of the state. So I was lucky that I went there. I could find all the records that I could find. What I did find was that in the school board minutes, they paid for the removal of 760 bodies. Not 112, not 200. There were 760 people buried in that little square block. Because when Simeon Nixon went to make his list in 1894, about 40 years before that, the North Side Cemetery opened. Remember in the 1850s, they're all saying, we need a new cemetery, we need a new cemetery. Well, they got one. And because people took care of their own families, some people dug up their own family graves and moved them up to North then. So when he went up in 1894 to write down names, a lot of those people were already moved. So his 100, and not everybody has headstones either. So when they moved the bodies, they found 760. There was also a blueprint made of the old cemetery because the school district didn't want to look totally disrespectful. They wanted to bury those people and make the graves in the new cemetery look just like the old cemetery. So they wanted a blueprint. They wanted to know where everybody was so that when they moved the bodies up to North Cemetery, they could put them in the same order. The sad part is that never happened. And this is where the cemetery is today, where the star is, I'll tell you about that, and where that red oval is down at the bottom, that's where most of the old graves are. This is an aerial view of North Cemetery in Butler, and that line going up through the middle is Main Street. If you were in town and headed north, you would start up the hill, and on your left, immediately as you start up the hill, that's where all the old graves are. Those are the graves from the old graveyard downtown. Where the red star is, that's where the mass grave is. So if you didn't answer the ad in the paper, then your person was probably put in the mass grave. That mass grave was never marked until around 2002, and that's the stone that's there. It just says that the founders of the town are buried here. That stone is only there because Gladys Reddick, who has the ancestor Charles McGinnis, she went to the commissioners and she said, I know that probably my relative is there and we need to have some kind of a marker. Now here's the other side of the story. Butler School District paid for markers for all those graves, but they never put them on. Seckler Monument Company, still in business today in Butler, was the company that was paid. And it's in the board minutes how much they were paid for each marker. And they were small markers. They might not have been names. They might have just been numbers to correlate to a blueprint. But when they put them all in the mass grave, nothing was marked. So that blueprint was all for nothing. They did not put them in the grave as they intended. They just merely moved the ones that family members requested, and then they put the rest in a mass grave. Now, I don't know about you, but I think when somebody is buried in a cemetery, they're supposed to stay there. I didn't think that it was ethical to even dig up a grave like this, but I'll tell you a little story about my family. One of my ancestors is a Revolutionary War patriot. He's buried in Westmoreland County in Polk Run Presbyterian Church, and there are many Revolutionary War soldiers buried there. And I'd gone there probably 30 years ago when I found out that he was in the family, and I wanted to see his grave. You could read it. I took a picture of the stone. It was amazing. He died in 1797, and his stone was still readable. But in the past 4 or 5 years, that stone has really disintegrated. And when I was there a year ago, you could hardly read his name. So I thought, I can't let it go. I have to find out from the church, did they ever, can I replace the stone? What can I do? And they said, well, if you want to replace it, we'll see if anybody else here in the church is a relative and if they want to help you pay for it. So we put out information and said, would you like to help pay for this? And nobody came forward. So I said, that's okay. I'm going to pay for it. So I went to Freeport Monuments, which was fantastic. I showed in the picture that I had from John Guthrie, died 1797. And I said, I want the stone to look exactly like that old one. And I want what's written on there to be in the same font, the same exact words. I don't want anything changed. I just want it to last. So he did. He made a monument for me, had it put in. I took the old one. I said, I don't want to get rid of the old one. So we laid it on top of his grave so you could still see it. But the new one is there so you can read it. Because, and this is where the point of my story is, back in the 1950s at Poke Run Presbyterian Church Cemetery, Boy Scouts came in and they were cleaning up the graveyard. When they started to clean it up, there were a lot of headstones they couldn't read. So their very bad choice, they made a choice to remove all the headstones you couldn't read and threw them over the hill. So I didn't want that to happen to my John. So I said, you know what? In fact, I said, what hill did they throw them over? I'll get my boots on. I want to go look for them. But that's what happens in some of these cemeteries. It's shameful because you think that it's going to be there forever, and it may not. So the problem with the Butler Cemetery is nobody even thought twice about moving. The Butler School Board did not think twice about moving it. The public did. There was a lot of editorials. There's a lot of disagreement. Many people wrote letters, said they didn't want this to happen, but it was out of their control. The board voted on it. A couple of school boards more members resigned over this because I think they knew it was the wrong thing to do. But when I was in Freeport at the Freeport Monument Company, I told that man at that point I was writing this book. And he said, well, that's not unusual. He said, Freeport High School right here in town, it was on the old cemetery too. So how many schools built between, I'd say 1900 and 1910? Wonder how many of them were built on old cemeteries. So the question is, but anyway, I wanted you to know the story. And I do have books available today for sale. I've self-published them. I didn't think anybody would be interested in, a big publisher wouldn't be interested in this. It's too local geography. And I didn't want to go to Amazon because I just didn't want to do that. So I thought, I'm just going to publish this book, several copies, and get the story out there to people, because if we don't write it down and pass it on, those people will all be forgotten. So in the book, what I did was what I did with what a few of those people in the beginning. I have a case study on every person that I knew was buried there. And I did find about 15 more. And you're going to say, well, how did you find out? Because there's no records. I went to probate records. I went to see if they had wills. I went to see newspapers, microfilm of all the newspapers. Butler County has microfilm of newspapers going back to 1818. I read every newspaper from 1818 to 1850 looking for death notices. And then I could say, okay, I know that person died here in the borough or in the town. And then I'd look for their probate records to see if I could find a will. And many of the probate records, let me put this down. Many of the probate records in those early records have little slips of paper that are notes that were written. And some of them are like, paid so-and-so $6 for opening the grave. And then they signed the name. So that's how I got a lot of the information, by looking at all those little pieces of paper in the probate records on microfilm. Those records are all available free of charge on FamilySearch.org. All the Butler County probate records are on there, all the wills are on there, and that's how I researched. I went to the courthouse, but most of their old records are now in storage. So you have to look at everything on microfilm. It was much easier to sit at home and do it when I had time than to go to the courthouse. So probate records gave me a lot of primary information. Newspapers, microfilm of newspapers gave me a lot of primary information. Other than that, I can't use census records. Even though our federal census started in 1790, it only listed the head of the household. In 1850, it starts listing every name in the house. So it doesn't help me create families until 1850. Well, most of these burials were pre-1850. So it was a real challenge to try to find information, but I did find as much as I could. I actually looked for pension records too for the Revolutionary War soldiers. Pensions started in 1818. So if they died before 1818, there's no pension. So there's a lot of places to look if you know where to look, and that's where a lot of my schooling helped and a lot of my past experience with genealogy helped. I've also published 2 books on my dad's side, a book on my dad's side and on my mother's side, back as far as I could go. My mother's side goes back to the Mayflower. My dad's side, they were coal miners from England, came over around 1882, but I traveled to Belfast, Ireland, and I found their marriage in Ireland in 1852. They changed their names, so now I'm looking for a different surname. So it's always a challenge, but it's fun. So I published books on both sides of the family, but what got me really started in genealogy, I was probably in 8th grade, and I had been at my grandmother's house. Like, I was there a lot. I practically lived with my grandparents. I loved going to their house. They didn't live far from us. And one day, my grandmother got a package in the mail, and it was this little binder with those little fasteners that you put through the hole and you separate them. Well, she had this little booklet, and she said, "Look what I got today in the mail." I thought, oh, okay. And her maiden name was Anthony. So it was the Anthony family history. Well, I started to look at it, and I'm in 8th grade. I was fascinated. I'm like, how do they know all of this? How do they know these people are related to us? And then when I got to the page that said Susan B. Anthony, that did it. I said, am I related to her? Yes, you are. She's a 5th cousin, I don't know how many times removed. And I said, now I need to know how you do this. So I started asking questions of my grandparents, of my parents, and luckily enough, I was smart enough to do it at that young age, because many of us get to an age where we think, why didn't I ask? Why didn't I find out more about this? So I was very lucky, and my grandmother saved every photograph ever. She had suitcases of photographs by the front door. In case the house burned down, we're going to take those suitcases out the door. That's how important her family pictures were. So if that's the case for you, and you love your family, make a tree, go to FamilySearch.org. They have free forms on there. You can just fill in your name, your dad's name, your mother's name, if you know their parents' names, and share that with family members, because someday they're going to wish that they had asked you some information. If you have some good stories, maybe you were in the military, write that down. Write down where you were. Tell somebody. If you can't write it, tell somebody else to write it for you, because if you don't get it written down, it's going to be forgotten. And thank goodness my son, who was in 6th grade at the time, was studying World War II. I knew my dad had been in World War II. He was in the Philippines. Did I know much more than that? No. He came home from school and said, "Grandpa, tell me about your war service. Tell me where you were." He wrote down every fort he had been to in chronological order. And I'm like, I didn't know you were at all these places. I had no idea. So write it down. Because if you don't write it down, it's going to be forgotten. The other piece of advice I'll give you, as a genealogist, which I do genealogy for people, and I have business cards over there, I love researching families. I just researched a family from Zillionople, as a matter of fact, for a man that lives in Turkey. He was born in Butler, but his roots came from Zillionople, and he needs dual citizenship in Europe. He said, find me an immigrant ancestor. So I did, but I think it's too far back. But anyway, I did what he wanted. I love to research, but I tell people one bit of advice, no matter how old you are, but especially at our age, write your own obituary now. You know you. Don't trust that to be written by someone else because they won't get the facts right. They don't know what you know about you. So write it down. And I just had a talk this morning over at Slippery Rock, and some lady said, well, what do I do with it? I said, well, if you've made funeral plans, give it to the funeral home. In fact, my husband and I made our plans this summer, and the funeral director said, if you write an obituary, bring it in. I'll put it in your file, and then we have it. I thought, well, isn't that smart? Because I wrote my mother's years ago, back in 2017, and I was pretty detailed in her obituary. So when my son tried to get into the Sons of the American Revolution, he had to have a lot of information. And I said, well, here's Grandma's obituary. He gave it to the registrar for SAR. The man called him and said, who wrote your mother's obituary? I have never seen an obituary this detailed in my life. And I said, well, it was me, because I need to put everything in there that's important. I said she was a descendant of Mayflower or Samuel Fuller. I said everything I knew. And somebody said, well, isn't it expensive to publish an obituary? You're only going to do it once. It's not a big deal. I mean, really? And you're going to spend money on something else anyway, right? I mean, funerals aren't cheap, but why not put your whole life out there? Because that's the only thing you're leaving, is those written words about you. So write your own obituary. Make sure you put your mother's name, maiden name, dad's name, if you know where they were born. That's important information. The other thing I'll say is death certificates. I research a lot of death certificates. They are on Ancestry from 1906 to 1972 in Pennsylvania. Ancestry is expensive. So if you're not a member, if you're not going to do genealogy on a regular basis like every day, it's hardly worth paying the money to do it. But FamilySearch.org is free. And it has a lot of the same information. Maybe a little bit more difficult to find, but it's all there. But the death certificates, they are a primary source, but when someone asks, the funeral director asks the family member, what were their parents' names and where were they born? Oh my gosh, if you ask my brother that right now, he wouldn't get it right. So I've seen a lot of mistakes on death certificates for father's and mother's name and where they were born. So make sure you put that in your obituary or write it down somewhere so it gets put on the death certificate the right way. Like I said, you're only doing this once. And this is what you're leaving for people to know about you. When I research somebody, the first thing I do is look for an obituary, because that guides me, that helps me to know where else to look. I don't know if it's all true, but I can go look for primary sources then and find out if it is. So that's my bit of advice for genealogy. That's my talk on the old Butler graveyard. If anybody has questions, I am certainly more than happy to answer any questions.
Can you roll back to the picture of the cemetery, Calvary Cemetery?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That one?
So that star is where that...
Mass grave is. That's the mass grave from the old graveyard. Butler School District bought all those lots. Yeah, there was a deed for those. So this is all North Cemetery, this is Calvary, and this is St. Peter's up here.
Point to that red star. Can you point to that red star?
Mm-hmm.
The top point?
This one?
Go to the top point of the red star.
Yes, yes.
My parents are buried right there.
Oh, is that right? Okay. Yeah, that whole hillside is pretty much, when you look in the next slide, see across, that's looking north. So your parents are probably those gravestones straight ahead.
Well, that's where that star was. That's on the front.
It's right along Main Street. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. That's the whole hillside facing Main Street.
Go back again. So St. Peter's is...
St. Peter's is up here. Uh-huh. Because there's a gate that says St. Peter's. It's an old gate, iron gate right here, but they don't use it.
Yeah, my family, they're buried a little higher.
Okay, because this is the entrance into North Side. Yeah, St. Peter's, there's still a big old iron gate up there, but that's not an entrance anymore. Oh, okay. Right. A lot of my husband's relatives are buried there too. So, yeah, it's pretty interesting. Now that every time I go by that on Main Street, I think about it. I think, gee, the founders of the town are up right on that hillside somewhere.
You talked about a Lowry. There's a Lowry House, which is a assisted living facility. That
Right.
relation to that?
It would probably be still named after Sir Walter's, Honorable Walter Lowry. There's just a lot of things named for him because he was such a big person, a big personality in Butler early on. I don't know that there are any Lowrys still living in Butler with that name. One of the sons died quite young, is buried with Amelia up in North Side. They were buried right beside each other. And I will say that most of the stones that I found are on the ground. Most of them are not standing up. And if they're on the ground, several of them, in fact, the one, this one, Sarah, this third one, that family, her and her husband, Robert Graham, are the ones that owned the farm that became Northside Cemetery. And her stone is probably 6 foot long, is cracked in half, and so is her husband's. But they were long because when they were original stones, they were probably this high, but you buried them 2 or 3 feet into the ground so they don't topple over. So when they took them out and laid them down, they're quite long. But most of them are, some of them are still readable, but I took photographs of every stone that I could find that was before 1850 because, soon enough, just like my ancestor in Poke Run, you're not going to be able to read them. So I did put all the photographs in the book so that we could at least see photographs of the stones. And then I was able to read most of them. The last one on the right there is my 4th great-grandmother, Barbara Ann Sedgwick.
Yeah, I just wondered if you ran across some of the problems that a group of us did before we published. I worked on the Wilcox family of New England, related to them. Also was working on my family tree, and we had to make a lot of corrections before we published. One in book form, one in a journal article. A lot of the information was totally inaccurate. Things like places of birth,
Right.
names. I had one uncle his last name was spelled 3 different ways. And he was supposedly buried in 3 different locations.
Wow.
So those are the type of things that we ran across.
Right.
I wonder if you ran across some of the things too, trying to name and locate these people.
I did. Like I said, the dates, a lot of time number transcriptions were not correct. When I looked at it, I could tell it was a certain number, but when it was written on Nixon's list, it wasn't that number. It was like 1815 might have been 1845. And I thought that wasn't right because I found the death notice in the paper on the right date. So his date was not correct for that person. But spellings, who knows? It was phonetically spelled many times. Names are phonetically spelled. So, it's not unusual to have the wrong spelling of a name. But depending on later dates, like when I check death certificates, that's when I find more mistakes because it would say somebody's born in Pennsylvania and then I find out they were born in Scotland. So it's just because it was misinformation given to somebody for a document.
Yeah, I had an uncle who was in Switzerland, but he spoke German, and a lot of his records,
Thought he was German.
that's where he was from. He was from
Right. And you have to remember, too, a lot of lines of countries, counties, townships changed over the years. They might have lived in one place, but it might have been 2 or 3 different places over time because of the change in history. So, even if he was living in Switzerland, if it was close to Germany and the line changed, maybe it was Germany at a time.
Yeah.
So you have to, yeah, exactly. Alsace-Lorraine is a big one. So you really learn a lot about history. I learned so much about history and geography by doing genealogy because now I can connect with those places. I didn't know where they were. Now I find out, where they are. And in fact, that's how my husband and I take vacations. He just loves the fact that I do research and let's go find out where so-and-so lived. So we go visit there. I taught my sons the alphabet in a graveyard. When they were in kindergarten, I said, we're looking for the letter B. So go run around and see if you find any B's anywhere, but don't tell your teacher because she's gonna think I'm weird. So yeah, there's lots of ways to use your information, but we especially like to travel, and we just did a trip about a month, not even a month ago. I got back October 5th. We were gone for 40 days, and we went across the Atlantic on a cruise ship because my grandfather was in World War I. He left from Montreal and went to Le Havre, France. I wanted to know what that journey was like. So we took a cruise ship from Quebec to Southampton, but we went to Le Havre, France to see the beaches of Normandy. So I got to go into the port, and I tell you, I was up at sunrise because I thought, oh my gosh, this is where my grandfather was. I was so excited about it. But we take trips everywhere. I've been to Italy to research my husband's family. And I will tell you that when we went there, I don't speak Italian. He doesn't speak Italian. I said, we're poco Italiano. So when we went there, and I went into the town record office, no one spoke English. And I thought, how am I going to find these records? So the man was as frustrated as I was in the office, and I just held my hand up. I said, I'll be back. So we went to, and this was before we had cell phones and iPads and all of that. I went to an internet cafe where you paid to use the internet for an hour and on their computer. So I typed in everything I wanted to know and how much I knew, and I had it translated to Italian, and I printed it. I took it back to the Italian record office the next day. That man was hugging and kissing me for like 10 minutes. He was so excited that he knew what I wanted because I couldn't tell him. Within 3 days, I had my husband's family back to the 1700s in that town in Italy. So, it's amazing the things that can happen when you put it all together. And we've been very fortunate that we've had good health and we're able to travel. But I've researched in Belfast, Ireland. I was there for a week at the Public Record Office. My husband was running around looking for the Titanic stuff, and I was researching dead people. But he's pretty used to that. But, it has opened our world to many places just because I know now where the family came from, and I want to go see where they were. I want to walk on the land that they lived on just because. And it's made me appreciate, listen, when we traveled across the Atlantic for 16 days, we had 3 days of weather that we had 20-foot waves. And I kept thinking, how in the world did those people come across the Atlantic? We all have people that came across the Atlantic at some point, whether it be in a plane or a boat. And then I'm thinking of my Mayflower ancestors. How in the world did they endure? I don't know. I said, we're a bunch of wimps, compared to those people. I said, good thing they came because we wouldn't be here. But it's an amazing journey to see where your family has been and what they have done. So like I said before, if you haven't written stories down, do it for your family and do it soon. Maybe for Christmas, that would be a great little gift. To write some stories down and say, here, this is what I did. It's my accomplishments, my military service, whatever. Any more questions from anyone? Thank you so much for having me today. I certainly appreciate being here. And please stop over at the table and look at a few things I have over there. If anyone has done DNA, I do DNA research as well, which is quite interesting. I always thought my maiden name was Kennedy. Well, I had my uncle, who was 100 years old when he died. I had him do his Y-DNA and his autosomal DNA. And I had a feeling the name had been changed. When he did his Y-DNA, which is only for men, Y-DNA takes a man back thousands of years. It does not name the names of the people you're related to, but it connects with other people that are related to you. His name was Kennedy, last name. His Y-DNA came back, there was not one Kennedy on the list. There were 5 matches, and 3 of them were Mulholland. And that's exactly what I thought their name had been changed from. And I found their marriage record in Northern Ireland, and yes, he changed his name from William Mulholland to William Kennedy sometime in the 1860s. Well, the question is why? And at that point, there were no courts. You didn't have to go through a court system to change your name. You could just change it if you wanted to. So that made it even more interesting. I don't know. I had another great aunt that lived to be 101. She said that she heard it was because he was a union organizer and he was blacklisted and he couldn't get jobs. So he changed his name, which made sense because he was a coal mine person and he wanted to form a union. So that was one of the possibilities. But it's a challenge everywhere you turn. It's so much fun. Like I said, if you have any questions, I am certainly happy to answer any of them. If not, I'll leave you with the tidbit of information. Write down your family stories and write your own obituary. Thank you, folks, for coming.
Igor.